Hello, this is Mike Swanson, and you're listening to the Wall Street Window podcast. In a few moments, I'm going to be speaking with Carmine Savastano. Carmine is the author of the book, Two Princes and a King, which details and examines the three key political assassinations that took place in the United States during the 1960s of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. And you can find more of Carmine's work at his website, tpaak.com. Now, Carmine is a researcher, an analyst, and really an expert into the national security state and many of the new documents that have come out over the past couple of years of the JFK file releases. Now, he discovered an interesting video, which is a training film done by the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. The OSS was the precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency. And what this video shows is how, and teaches, is how to be an effective spy. So it's an interesting thing to take a look at and have a talk about with Carmine, and that's what I'm going to do in just a few moments. And if you want to watch the video yourself, I've got it linked to below this podcast on my website with the blog post for it. Now, before I talk to Carmine, I want to tell you I've done something interesting with my website that you may want to take advantage of if you have your own blog or your own website for that matter, whether that website's about financial topics or news topics or whatever it is, and you're looking for content, because that's a big problem anyone that has an internet presence has, is putting out more content. Well, I've just created something that you can do to use my content on your own internet properties for free. And you can't use every single post on my website because they're not all mine. I'm getting them from other people. But what I'm doing is every single day you'll be able to click the very top post on the site, and if you do that, you'll see on the right sidebar something that says republish the story. So you click that and you'll have code, you copy and paste it, and then you can put on your blog, your website, whatever the case, and boom, you got information right from me. Most of this is going to be stories I write, because typically I put something every single morning up on the website. And you also can do that with a blog post for this podcast. All these podcast posts you'll be able to republish at your will. When you use the code, it'll have a simple link right at the bottom of it that links back to the original post. These posts are Creative Commons. That means you're free to use them online. You could actually even use them in print. So that's just the way I'm trying to get more of my information out there, and it's something that if you got a website, you may really want to take advantage of, because sharing good information is what you want to do to build an audience and help people. So all that said, let's go and talk with Carmine after one little quick break.
Go ahead, caller.
Yeah, I'm interested in the truth about the JFK assassination.
Right. Well, what do you want to know?
Judy Baker's wild claim, Oswald girlfriend, she knew Ruby and Barry, cancer weapons. Really?
I imagine I could claim I have 4 wheels. It doesn't make me a wagon, but okay.
Oswald was on the kill team and trying to prevent the murder of John Kennedy. Come on now. Has a real expert on the JFK assassination looked into her claims?
Go to Amazon.com, enter Judith Baker in her own words. You'll get results for a digital copy of a book where Walt Brown utilizes her own words and the known evidence in the case to get at, well, a different perspective, let's say. You can get Judith Barry Baker in her own words from the author himself, signed if you request it, by contacting Dr. Brown at KIASJFK@AOL.com. It's a fun book, and it actually dissects the many, many fantastic claims. Judith Barry Baker in her own words.
Thank you for all the great information.
Well, hello, Carmine. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, Mike. Glad to be back on the show.
Yeah, thank you. You sent me something really interesting last week, and that's a video that you found that was done in 1943 by the U.S. government, by the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency. That is a training movie to show people how to be an effective spy when they go and operate behind enemy lines. So it's kind of like teaches you how to be the equivalent of James Bond. I thought, I'm going to post a link to it with this interview, but I thought it was real interesting to watch and maybe worth talking about.
Yeah. I was I came across it a while back, and with research and most of the stuff we're doing, I never really had the opportunity to post it, and I want to try to put some more videos on the NEMG Facebook, or not a Facebook, but a YouTube page. And I was like, okay, this would be a good one. I don't put up one very often. When I do, I try to make it a good one. But yeah, it's a really interesting thing that's been out there for a while. I've seen it in a couple of places, but it's hard to find an original copy. And since it is a work of the government, pretty much anybody can check it out and can use it. So I wanted to try to make it more available to people to have a look at. It's interesting to me because, for a few reasons. Of course, one is, how often are you going to see a movie that tells you how to be a spy step by step? That's not something you probably have seen in the last 50 years, besides fiction. And this is actually done by an official, intelligence agency of the United States government. So we see, and I'm sure it's a lot different now, with all of the new areas they're operating in and all of the new technology. But the standard things are pretty much the same.
Well, one thing about the movie, it's a high production movie. I remember being a little kid, in elementary school and watching film strips. But this would probably more high quality than even those were, because it's directed by John Ford, who filmed The Grapes of Wrath, a bunch of westerns, and other movies. He's a giant film director back then.
It was created during 1944 in the final stages of World War II to demonstrate some of the necessary elements of spycraft and developing a strong cover to provide agents tools for successful OSS operations. And while not credited in the film, like you said, because it was a secret work of the U.S. government, a couple of famous names are pretty recognizable. It has Hollywood director John Ford, and he played a guy named J.P. Baldwin and wore dark glasses in the movie. There's a character actor named Pierre Watkin, who was an actor that was in a lot of classic films, and he plays British Agent Z in Undercover. There's another gentleman named Martin Garalaga, who was known for his portrayal of the Cisco Kid, and he played the role of an Axis spy in the film. And maybe the most famous, Peter Lorre, who's famous for movies like M and what is it? The Maltese Falcon, The Invisible Agent. But
The Third Man, I think.
Yeah, The Third Man. That's another one. Yeah. And he's only in for a couple minutes in the beginning, but he plays the nefarious Axis spy they're looking for. There's also an actress, Osa Masson. She was a television and film actress, and she's the barmaid in the movie. So yeah, with this, this small cast of notables and talented players, the U.S. government put together a film that might seem a little, old-fashioned and maudlin to us now, but at the time it was cutting edge. This was a how-to film to a very limited amount of people to learn how to be a spy.
Well, it's 60 minutes long, and I got the impression from the beginning of it that, well, first of all, it starts off showing some sort of classroom environment, and where it's being introduced by a Colonel Henson Robinson, who was the chief of the OSS Division of Schools and Training. So he's in there introducing the film, and then he comes on at the end too. And by having that introduction, it gave me the feeling that this movie was probably created to be used to start a discussion after it would be watched by the people watching it. It'd be filmed, it'd be shown in a classroom, and then they would have a discussion around it. What did they learn from it, and so forth. And there is lots of interesting stuff in it for sure. I think it tells the story of two people who are being recruited to become undercover agents to go in enemy lines and spy, and how to do it effectively. And one of them does a good job, and the other one, his cover gets blown at the end of the movie. You still there?
Yeah. I said it's Al and Charlie. They're kind of like the Goofus and Gallant of the spy world.
Yeah. So the Charlie guy is very careful and almost scared and nervous.
Yeah.
Because
he should be.
Yeah, it is scary. Because look, if these guys get caught, they could just be probably shot.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're going to go to the SS station, and that's not a fun place to be.
Yeah. Well, it's and that's what the whole film is basically based around. It's the general protocols for developing and maintaining an undercover identity, and how to successfully do it using Al and Charlie as your examples. The best targeting operation for trying to gather up anything you can about enemy interests. Like you were saying, for the methods of penetrating enemy nations, airdrops, secret landings, small boats, even on foot, how to get in, the best way to get in on foot that you want to come from within the country's interior, even if you have to hook around, so that you're not coming from the border, so they don't ask you about being from the border and they don't suspect you of being a spy. So there, like you said, there's some very interesting tips in the movie that probably still apply. And the film, using Al and Charlie, draws comparisons between basically what proves to be an effective OSS agent and a bungling one, and then the results of either following each proper step or ignoring them, and what happens. What was it? I think in one part of the movie, one of the distinctions they made was it's not just as simple as not drawing attention to yourself. You of course have to do that, but a basic yet important habit, if you want to avoid detection by witnesses, enemy groups and local authorities, is you don't want to do anything that draws attention. Just not following this apparent precaution, with a distraction. If you don't follow this precaution, you'll get busted. You could be shot. At best, you'll get traded back. At worst, you'll spend the rest of your life in a prison in a foreign country. So.
And the one person that's very, the better agent, will say, who's very careful, even he makes a mistake that could have wound made him get in big trouble. And he has cigarettes and, does what...
Not from that area.
What anyone would do, it's just not, if you smoke anything, often you don't, if you smoke a cigarette, often you don't smoke the entire cigarette, and you leave half in a cigarette thing or whatever. And he does that, and they point out that at the time, because of the war, and the cigarettes were so rare that people aren't going to waste them. So that would have drawn attention to him. Doing anything unusual that causes people to ask questions is basically what they warn these guys not to do. Anything.
Anything out of local custom, anything that deviates, like you said, if cigarettes are rare, you're not going to waste them. So you're from somewhere where they're not rare.
Yeah, and then he's, you basically, if you act out of place, I
was going to say,
talk right.
Yeah, and to that point, and it goes to all levels. I think the average person is going to consider. It's like, I think in one part of the movie they're talking, the agent was selecting where he's going to stay in a foreign city. And it shows the merits and the mistakes of possible locations as he's looking around, the more careful agent. And one apartment he sees, it's really nice, it's clean, but he disregards it because there's a local person outside that's often in conversation with others that watches everybody that goes around. So you're going to basically be under surveillance. Not an intelligence group, but just someone who talks. So if another intelligence group comes by and says, hey, anybody new moved in? That person's going to tell them.
Oh, yeah.
So you want a quiet place. You don't want a bunch of people that hang around the front of wherever you're going to be staying if you're a spy. And then, you've got another thing, like Mike was saying, having to be familiar with it. You have to know the local area. If you don't know the whole local area, you're not from that area. So where are you from?
Well, one thing interesting about that is they had 3 ways to get into the country. One just over land, and then by parachute.
Yep.
And then a guy going over by boat. These 3 examples, and by land they showed doing it by train. I think is the way they did that. But in all those cases, they had the people. You couldn't carry a map because that would be very suspicious.
Yeah, you'd know where you're going if you're from there.
Yeah, so you had to have the area memorized. And spy stuff, they didn't really go into what the spy stuff would be, but, spycraft materials, they also will not bring in with them. All that kind of stuff that they might need, they would get later on once they're already in place from underworld, not underworld, what they call it, resistance contacts. Yeah. So one thing underground contacts. So they did have, people that they're supposed to meet up with once they established themselves. So what they were showing in the movie was these guys getting there, and then I guess it wasn't clearly explained, but they're establishing themselves over some period of time and then making contact with their underground person. And the one character succeeds in doing all this, and the other one does not, and ends up, never contacting the person. He fears his cover is blown.
Yeah, they like you were saying about establishing the cover and becoming more familiar with the territory and everything. Another thing they have to do is get a job.
Mm-hmm. And
imagine you're in a foreign country. What if you don't speak the language?
That's kind of difficult.
It's going to be difficult to get a job.
And I think that's one thing, I know we've done discussions with this, or you have, maybe both of us, with Chuck Ocelli at some time or another about the programs after World War II that the CIA was doing to try to get agents like this basically into the Iron Curtain. They did it during the Vietnam War, and all these attempts are pretty much failures. The people would get caught almost all the time. So that's how difficult it is.
Yeah, they didn't even have basically a functional station. I believe it was until 1960 or 61. I have to look up the exact date, but the CIA didn't even have a functional station in Moscow until then, because everybody they sent in beforehand was compromised.
Yeah.
It's very, I would imagine, that's one of the things people don't consider is that the United States, for all of our flaws, for all of the illegal things our government has done over time in history, we still are a largely open society. So we do not have a lot of the protections that a regime who is willing to ignore rights and free speech does. It's a lot harder to find out intelligence and get information in a place like Russia or the Soviet Union, where there is a dictatorship or oligarchy in charge, and they can set the legal rules. So that can make it a lot harder to get intelligence. Over here, pretty much anybody you ask will tell you almost what you want to know. So it's a lot easier in an open society to get intelligence. which is why I think sometimes in an open society you see a lot more counterintelligence, because the intelligence agencies are trying to balance the useful information with harmful information, so that if spies are over here gathering stuff, they don't just get good information, they get bad information too. So it's a balance. You have to strike a balance. And, this movie is probably one of the earliest examples of trying to do that. Trying to codify some sort of system of the best way, an OSS agent would go about establishing themselves and undertaking operations.
Now, I wondered watching this, and then at the end of it, it had a suggestion to this question of mine, but I wondered watching this, how many Americans actually were doing this, trying to create a cover and then be like James Bond or something and go into behind the enemy lines and do all these things. I wondered how many people are really doing that, as opposed to not being an agent, but running a network of agents.
Yeah, like Dulles.
Yeah, or James Angleton, James Angleton was doing this in Rome. Trying to, not really being that secretive, really, but they're there and they're trying to run agents instead of like be a secret agent. And at the end of this movie, they kind of suggested that they said to the people watching it, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but the odds are you're not going to be doing what these guys in the movie are doing, but you've got to know about it, because you're either going to be running these people or you're going to be in the office somewhere,
supporting their operation,
supporting them. And either way, you've got to know how serious and dangerous what these people are doing out in the field, because you can blow their cover too.
Yeah.
Being in Washington, D.C. and talking to the wrong person. Because the Germans did have agents in the United States during World War II, and they mentioned, I don't know if it was fictional, but they showed some German agent in the United States in this movie, but they had some, Yeah,
and it does really come back to what they're trying to stress in the movie is true, the importance of maintaining your cover, and that the slightest mistake. I remember what was it? One of the precautions that they recommended is when you go into an enemy area, you have to be outfitted head to toe with proper dress, and that if all it all has to be local. So all clothing and possessions must be local or crafted to mimic local sources. And the slightest deviation from a style or a mark with foreign materials without a sufficient excuse and normal access to such things is going to draw attention. I think there was that one scene where an agent was captured and executed because he didn't pay attention to a grooming item he brought with him. He basically used an English hair pomade, and they found it in his room. And that's what got him. He had gone to Britain before his assignment, and he just didn't let go of this hair gel that he wanted to use. And that's what took him down. So even the slightest mistake. Another one was a slip of the tongue. And the guy's lucky. Someone testing an agent in a state of helplessness is something they had to worry about too. So the film had a scene of a sleeping agent that was quickly awoken and asked his name, and he responds with his true name.
No,
not his cover identity. So lucky for him, the person asking was an OSS contact testing his ability to respond. But if that would have been an agent of the enemy, you're dead.
Yeah, or just a sympathizer.
Yeah, you're toast. You gave them your true name.
Well, do you think there were Americans doing this at the time?
Oh, certainly.
Yeah.
If from our conversations, and I think those are accurate representations from the files we've looked at, I'm sure Donovan had dozens of people doing this, maybe even over 100.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was trying to penetrate every aspect they could of German and Japanese operations. Italian, too. Well, Mussolini was in charge anyway.
Well, would you think that I know in the case of Vietnam, because I'm reading a lot about it, that I mean, Americans weren't going to North Vietnam, but they were trying to get South Vietnamese people to,
Yeah.
jump over there out of airplanes or whatever and do this sort of work, and all of them got caught. Not a single one of them succeeded, and I'm talking about, maybe several hundred people over the years. I mean, they were killed, or at least jailed, and so that's how difficult it is. And I mean, these people spoke the language, or from the country, so I'm thinking that with Americans doing this during World War II, the only way they would have been successful is by making contact with a sympathetic underground, which frankly didn't exist in North Vietnam and didn't exist, with the CIA people sending people to the Iron Curtain during the Cold War, but it certainly existed for the Allies in France and in other occupied countries.
What's kind of, what's ironic about, because it's such a ridiculous premise, but the old TV show Hogan's Heroes.
Yeah.
That might have been the actual one setting where we could have inserted American agents to help, is in prisons.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I don't think necessarily it was anything like that show, of course, but there has been operations, I'm sure, in various military actions where the only way you could get away with having an extra American would be to throw him among the prisoners. And then you just have him in there as a means of gathering intelligence.
Well, in this case, they would have to be Americans. They'd have to be people that speak. They'd have to be Frenchmen, that are Americans.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, you have to have. Yeah, you've got to, just to be able to function. The only reason I think they would bring in people who don't speak the language is for military operations and stuff. You don't want to bring in somebody who's a babe in the woods in a foreign land, like we were talking about getting a job. You have to have some sort of grasp of the language. So these people are going to be rare. They're, I think that's why.
Yeah.
This is,
and then yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's like I said. I'm sure they tried a bunch, but I doubt very many of them were successful.
And I think a lot of I know, again, I go back to Vietnam, but in Southeast Asia during World War II, we were fighting Japan, and there were lots of OSS people. I don't mean tens of thousands, but 100 or something, or several, that were operating in Southeast Asia. But I don't think they were doing this kind of work. They were more like sort of paramilitary type stuff, supporting forces fighting the Japanese. For example, there were lots of people embedded with Chiang Kai-shek, but also the OSS had about a dozen people that were operating in Vietnam right at the end of the war with Ho Chi Minh. So, because his force was the only indigenous force opposing Japan in the final months of the war there.
Yeah. I'll give you a couple of the references with the show, and in the OSS history that I have on TPOC, people can look at some of the regiments and the groups that were operating with the OSS. Because you're right, they had detachments. I believe it was Detachment 101, but they had detachments. It was the Special Operations. They were in the Special Operations branch, and it was a commando force basically. And they had them training Burmese Kachin tribesmen behind Japanese enemy lines. And what they would do is basically do intelligence gathering, sabotage, propaganda. They'd rescue Allied service members that crashed behind enemy lines.
Yeah, that's what they were doing. That's what they were really doing most of, trying to rescue people down by airplanes.
Yeah, I think eventually too they helped
Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think eventually, too, they helped liberate the capital of Burma.
Okay.
Yeah, so they were effective. They were small, though. It wasn't like these were little groups that were basically helping with local resistance. It just goes to show you, maybe instead of all the larger wars that we had later, it might have been better to do it that way.
Yeah.
But anyway. So I think it's a really interesting movie. It shows you an aspect of intelligence and training that you rarely see. You certainly don't see it in modern times anyway.
Well, that's also what I wondered watching this is, does this go on that much in modern times, or is everything so dominated by, technology and
Well,
computers and so forth?
well, I think, like I said earlier, it's the basics are always the same. It doesn't matter how much tech they introduce into this. You still need human intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
You can spy on people all day long and try to. I mean, if they're dumb enough, sure. If they're going to be, which people might say that's harsh, but oh well. That's if you're going to do this, you can't be stupid. And if you're going to text everything that you ever think, then you're making a log of everything you ever think. And someone is going to see that log. So you pretty much should never try to do this if you feel the need to put all your innermost thoughts down on paper or in a phone. That's the first thing. So I think it still goes on, but I think that it's limited. You have to have basic understanding of spycraft to function no matter what technology you're using.
Well, in the movie, they had the two characters, Student Al, who succeeds, and then Student Charlie, who fails. And what Student Charlie does is, in his recruiting meeting, he's just so overconfident.
Yeah.
He's just like, I know the area, I've lived there, and his cover is he's going to be a fisherman, right? And then when they go to get him ready, he makes some mistakes, and he's got to be more careful. So he figures that out, and looks like he might be successful. And they mentioned the good part about this Student Charlie is that he is very brave, doesn't have much fear about this assignment. He's pretty confident he's going to be successful. And then he gets over there and he goes in a bar and talks to this girl in there, and she has a boyfriend that's working on he's a crewman on a submarine, and the Charlie guy asks the girl these questions about him. He's trying to get information about the submarines and stuff, and that makes her very suspicious, and she ends up telling her boyfriend about the guy, and he's just made himself stand out so much too. He gave her a big tip of money to pay
everything
buy one of her drinks. Yeah, and then he's talking to this girl in front of her boyfriend. It's in a corner. Just everything you could do to stick in someone's mind at least. So that's why that's what starts the process of his cover getting blown. But he does dumb things. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he has a low IQ or is not intelligent.
Yeah.
In fact, he could be more intelligent if these guys took an IQ test than the other guy. The other guy doesn't talk much. He doesn't have much facial expressions. If the movie film was based around him, it would become very boring to watch. But he's successful in the mission, obviously. So what I want to suggest is that I think one thing this story reveals is that there may be people who are psychologically incapable of this type of work. They just can't. They can't be calm enough to act the way they need to act without blowing their cover. And I think, they can't help. Yeah, that's the best way to put it. They can't help themselves. And I think that this movie demonstrates that or teaches that lesson. And first thought, someone watching this might think that this is just an idiot and the story is overdone or it's too silly the way the guy blows his cover. But I would say this could be much more common problem the casual viewer would think. That there are a lot of people simply that would be incapable of doing this type of work. Period.
Well, I agree. I think that there's room for both. I think that a lot of people are probably not savvy enough, and whether you want to say, I say dumb, whether you want to say dumb or ignorant or untrained or however you want to say it, but basically they do not have the qualifications to do it. There's those group of people, and then there's the people you're talking about, which they need attention, or they don't do things quietly. They can't do things quietly.
Yeah.
They do things loud, and they attract attention naturally, and they can't help themselves. So I bet you there's some of both. And then there's going to be people who are good at it. People who are. It's funny because in politics or in certain realms of public life, it's great to attract attention, especially now. Unfortunately, there are so many people that want fame and attention. They'll do anything for it. But to do this well, you want to do the opposite. You don't want to be remembered. You don't want anyone to know who you are until it's too late and everything's done. They want to. You want them to remember you after you're flying out of the country and they're realizing everything has just gone down.
Yeah,
that's when you want them to remember you.
Well, even then, you want them to even have trouble remembering what you even look like, even at that point. I mean, honestly, even right now, I even though I watched the last half of this a few hours ago,
it's hard to remember what
it's hard to remember what that guy looks like. This dude now.
Yeah, it's the good guy. Wants to remember him.
I can remember what the other guy looks like, the girl, but
yeah. Well, it's funny. You're right. Yeah, in a way, having personality is a bad thing unless it's specifically designed for that particular operation.
Yeah.
You don't have a personality. You want to be forgettable.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Yep. Yeah. No,
well, I've seen some old movies and I think they're World War II movies. I've just seen parts of it, of training films for trying to teach you how to hold up under interrogation and stuff like that. I might have to try see if I can find those.
Yeah, those have got to be interesting. They can't be realistic because it's with interrogation. If it's light interrogation, sure, but if they get heavy on you and they start using violence, anybody pretty much is going to say anything after enough time. It's not a question of if you're going to be Rogan, it's a question of when.
Well, and one funny thing about this movie is there was a curse word in it, and then the movie, one of the characters in the movie was considering getting with a prostitute, and they talked about prostitution in it.
In the interrogation thing?
Oh no, this movie.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, no, I totally forgot.
Yeah. It was that's how forgettable the guy. That's how forgettable Stu now is. Yeah. But he, for a moment in the movie, he was thinking about getting with a prostitute, and the narrator
you shouldn't
said,
do that.
"You don't do that." But his reason for not doing it wasn't because it's wrong or because you might catch a disease or something, but because these prostitutes are also very likely being paid by the enemy to give them information. So it's a security risk to get involved with them. And I just thought, well, it's kind of funny because this is a movie made in 1943, and I don't think very many movies would have stuff like that in them. Not even in the 50s or early 60s. So this shows to me that this was, the intended audience was, men in the OSS, right?
Yeah, it was not the public.
We could be a little more risque for this sort of usage and sticking this in the movie theater.
That is interesting. Yeah, no, I didn't even really think about that aspect much. But yeah, no, that is true. It certainly shows you once again that this was not intended for the public.
And it was classified, actually, till once the war was over.
But even classified stuff, you usually don't hear. The only other reference in the discussions we've had where I've read about prostitution being involved in an operation was, a couple, actually.
MK Ultra. But
Sukarno, when they were trying to get Sukarno prostitutes, who was the president of Indonesia, for those who don't know. and when what was the other one? I know it's a means of compromise that's listed in a couple manuals, like how to compromise someone and stuff. Honey traps. You're supposed to be careful about honey traps. But also with Yuri Nisenko, who is a famous defector. That's actually something we can actually look in the files, and as sort of the way to make up for having kept him in isolation for all those years, they got him prostitutes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's crazy.
Yeah. Well,
Well, let me ask this. So, watching this movie, do you think James Bond is a good spy, or is he too showy and
way too showy? Horrible. James Bond is a great movie to watch, and he is a horrible spy. He is the worst. Everything about him attracts attention. Everything. When he goes to the bar, shaking nuts. He's just like, I'd like a drink, please. He makes a big deal about everything. Yeah, totally.
Well, that's a part of the movie too. They tell you how to get a drink at a bar, and they say you don't want to go in a bar and just order your favorite drink, because that could be out of the ordinary. You don't know what are the popular drinks in that area you're in. So they suggested that you look around and see what everyone else is drinking before you order one, or just act uncertain and let the bartender pick one for you.
Exactly. Or the cheapest.
Yeah.
Yeah, whatever the house thing is.
Yeah. So no, I'm glad you found this. It's certainly interesting, and I think it's worth people to take the time to watch it and think, watch this and compare this to what you see in a James Bond movie, and you'll see, what real spying is about.
Yeah. It's interesting too, just to see because it does seem very dated and, like you were saying, like a film strip from back when we were kids. That they'd show for, it reminds me kind of like, you remember some of the old, the 50s, like warning movies about like, venereal disease or reefer madness.
Yeah, sure.
Movies like that. It's just like, but I mean, it's interesting because it's that sort of a, kind of a hokey 50s thing going on, but it's a very serious subject. And they talk about all sorts of crazy things that you wouldn't imagine would be in this sort of a 50s, setting.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's definitely, it's all around. It's got some interesting stuff to show. I hope everybody enjoys it.
Well, thanks for taking the time to talk to me and take your time to do this segment with me and the audience. And we'll talk again soon.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Talk to you again soon.